The dull thump of the stagecoach wheels against hardened earth matched the rhythm of Abigail Ellis's heart as she clutched the small bundle beneath her shawl. The Wyoming territories, unforgiving July sun beating down mercilessly. It was 1876, a year when America celebrated its centennial with grand festivities back east, but here in the untamed West, Abigail was running from shame rather than toward celebration. The coach jerked violently as it hit a rut, and Abigail winced, instinctively curling her body around her 5-month-old daughter, Sarah. The baby, seemingly unbothered by the jarring journey, slept soundly against her mother's chest. A miracle, Abigail thought, considering how little sleep either of them had gotten since fleeing Denver 3 days ago. "Not much further to Independence now, madam," the driver called down. "Should see at once we clear this ridge. Independence, Wyoming." A small cattle town where Abigail hoped to disappear, where the whispers and pointing fingers of Denver society would be nothing but a painful memory. She'd chosen it precisely because it was unremarkable, just another dusty settlement where a widow and her child might start anew without questions about a non-existent husband. Except Abigail wasn't a widow. She was worse in the eyes of society, an unwed mother, carrying the evidence of her sin for all to judge. The father, a charming banker's son who had promised marriage before disappearing east with his family's fortune, had left her with nothing but a swollen belly and a ruined reputation. The stagecoach crested the hill, and Independence came into view, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest like an accusing finger pointing heavenward. Abigail swallowed hard. Would this place be any different? Or would the scarlet letter she felt branded upon her chest be just as visible here? As the coach rolled into town, Sarah stirred against her chest, whimpering softly. "Shh, little one," Abigail whispered, pressing her lips to her daughter's forehead. "We'll be fine now, we'll be fine." The coach came to a halt in front of the Independence Hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The driver hopped down and opened the door, extending his hand to help Abigail descend. "Here we are, madam. Independence. Not much to look at, but it's growing." Abigail nodded her thanks, adjusting Sarah in her arms while the driver retrieved her single trunk. As her feet touched the dusty street, she felt eyes upon her, curious glances from passers-by, evaluating the newcomer with undisguised interest. She pulled her shawl tighter around Sarah, as if the thin fabric could shield them both from judgment. "Need help with that trunk, lady?" The voice was deep and carried the easy drawl of the frontier. Abigail turned to find a tall man approaching, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen years of sun and weather. A cowboy, one of many who passed through these towns driving herds north to the railheads. "I can manage, thank you," Abigail replied stiffly, reaching for her purse to pay the driver. The man stepped closer, and Abigail caught sight of his face, weathered from sun and wind, but younger than she'd initially thought. Perhaps 30 or so, with eyes the color of the Wyoming sky and a jawline dusted with several days' worth of stubble. "Madam, that trunk looks mighty heavy for someone holding a baby," he said, his tone matter of fact rather than condescending. "Name's Ross Atkins. I work at the Double Circle Ranch outside town." Before Abigail could protest further, Ross Atkins had lifted her trunk with an easy strength that made her previous struggles with it seem foolish. "Which way you headed?" he asked. Abigail hesitated. She'd planned to take a room at the hotel, but only until she could secure more permanent lodging. Her modest savings wouldn't last long. "The hotel for now," she said. "I'm new to Independence," Ross nodded, heading toward the hotel entrance. Figured as much. Don't get many stagecoach arrivals who aren't either passing through or looking to stay. Inside the hotel lobby, little more than a small room with a desk and a worn settee, an older woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun looked up from her ledger. "Room for the lady," Ross said, setting the trunk down carefully. The woman's eyes flicked from Ross to Abigail, then to the bundle in her arms. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just yourself?" the woman asked, her gaze lingering on Sarah. "My daughter and I," Abigail said, lifting her chin slightly. "We'll need the room for several days, possibly longer." The woman's pen scratched across the ledger. "That'll be $1 a day, meals extra. I'll need a name for the book." "Abigail Ellis," she said. Then the lie she'd rehearsed. "Mrs. Abigail Ellis." The woman's expression didn't change as she wrote the name. "Room 4, top of the stairs. Breakfast is at 6, dinner at 5, no cooking in the rooms." Ross picked up the trunk again. "I'll take this up for you, Mrs. Ellis." Abigail followed him up the narrow staircase, acutely aware of his presence in front of her, broad-shouldered and moving with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. At the door to room 4, he set her trunk down and stepped aside. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins," Abigail said formally. "You've been very kind." Ross removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Just Ross is fine, madam, and it wasn't any trouble." His eyes moved to Sarah, who had awakened and was blinking up at the strange man with curious eyes. A smile softened his features. "Beautiful baby you've got there." Abigail tensed, waiting for the inevitable questions. "How old? Where's your husband? Why come to Independence alone?" But they didn't come. Instead, Ross just settled his hat back on his head and said, "Welcome to Independence, Mrs. Ellis. If you need anything, folks around here are generally helpful, despite what Mrs. Parsons downstairs might make you think." He offered a small smile. "Town's not much, but it's got good people." With a nod, he turned and headed back down the stairs, boots echoing on the wooden steps. Alone in the small room, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing her shoulders to slump with the exhaustion of the journey. Sarah began to fuss, hungry after the long ride. "I know, little one," Abigail murmured, unbuttoning her blouse to feed her daughter. As Sarah nursed, Abigail gazed out the window at the main street of Independence, watching the townspeople go about their business under the late afternoon sun. She'd come here to escape judgment, to build a quiet life where she and Sarah might live in peace. But peace required money, and Abigail's funds were limited. She needed work, and soon, but who would hire a woman with an infant and no husband? The shame she'd fled in Denver might find her here just as easily, cloaked in the practical concern of employers rather than the overt scorn of society. Sarah's tiny hand reached up to touch her mother's face, and Abigail caught it gently, pressing a kiss to the perfect miniature fingers. "We'll find our way," she promised her daughter. "Somehow." The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crystalline light that only seemed to exist in the high country. Abigail dressed in her simplest gown, a navy blue cotton with minimal embellishment, and pinned her chestnut hair into a sensible knot. With Sarah secured in a sling across her chest, she descended to the hotel dining room. Mrs. Parsons nodded curtly as Abigail took a seat at a small table. Only 2 other guests were present, a traveling salesman engrossed in a newspaper, and an elderly woman sipping tea. Breakfast was simple: cornbread, fried ham, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Abigail ate quickly, formulating her plan for the day. She needed to familiarize herself with the town and, most importantly, find work. Independence proved to be even smaller than it had appeared from the stagecoach. The main street hosted the expected businesses: general store, post office, blacksmith, saloon, and a small bank. A schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, and beyond it, small houses dotted the landscape, becoming sparser as they gave way to the vast open range. At the general store, a bell jingled as Abigail entered. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from stocking shelves. "Morning, madam. Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Good morning. I'm Mrs. Ellis. My daughter and I arrived yesterday." The man smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "Walter Green at your service. Welcome to Independence. What can I help you with today?" "Information, primarily," Abigail said. "I'm looking for work in town. I can sew, cook, keep accounts. I was hoping you might know of opportunities." Mr. Green's expression turned thoughtful. The mercantile in Cheyenne often needs seamstresses, but that's a fair journey from here." He scratched his chin. "Doc Simmons might need help with his records. He's getting on in years and his penmanship ain't what it used to be. And there's always the school, though term doesn't start for another month." "I'd be interested in any of those positions," Abigail said eagerly. "Where might I find Dr. Simmons?" "His office is just down the street, white building with the blue door. Can't miss it." Abigail thanked him and turned to leave when the bell jingled again. Ross Atkins stepped through the door, removing his hat as he entered. Something in Abigail's chest tightened at the sight of him in the clear morning light. He was undeniably handsome, with strong features and those remarkably blue eyes. "Morning, Walt," he greeted the shopkeeper before noticing Abigail. "Mrs. Ellis, good to see you settling in." "Mr. Atkins," she acknowledged with a small nod. "Thank you again for your assistance yesterday." "Ross was just telling me about you last night at the saloon," Mr. Green said. "Said we had a new widow in town with a little one." Abigail's gaze shot to Ross, who looked momentarily uncomfortable. "I hope I didn't presume too much, madam," he said quietly. "No, it's accurate enough," Abigail replied, hating the lie but clinging to its protection. "My husband passed in Denver. We decided to make a fresh start here." Ross's expression was unreadable. "Sorry for your loss." An awkward silence fell, broken only when Sarah made a small sound from her sling. Ross's face immediately softened. "Your daughter seems to be taking to Independence just fine," he observed. Despite herself, Abigail smiled. "She's adaptable. More so than her mother, perhaps." Ross turned to Mr. Green. "Walt, I need those supplies for the ranch. Mr. Carson's expecting them by noon." As the two men discussed the order, Abigail slipped out of the store, strangely unsettled by Ross Atkins's presence. There was something about him, a directness, an honesty in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. As if he could see right through her carefully constructed story to the truth beneath. Dr. Simmons's office was indeed exactly where Mr. Green had described. The doctor himself proved to be a kindly gentleman in his 70s with a shock of white hair and hands that trembled slightly with age. "Bookkeeping, you say?" he asked after Abigail introduced herself. "Haven't had anyone handling my records proper since Mrs. Simmons passed 2 years ago. Been making a hash of it, truth be told." "I'm very organized," Abigail assured him, "and I understand the importance of medical confidentiality." Dr. Simmons glanced at Sarah, who was contentedly chewing on her own fist. "The little one won't be a distraction. She's a good baby," Abigail said. "And I can work around her schedule." The doctor nodded slowly. "Could use the help, that's certain. Can't pay much, $3 a week for afternoons, Monday through Friday. Would that suit?" It wasn't much, but it was a start. Abigail accepted gratefully, and they agreed she would begin the following Monday. With that small victory secured, Abigail continued her exploration of Independence. At the schoolhouse, She found the teacher, Miss Beatrice Porter, a spinster of about 50, receptive to the idea of Abigail assisting when the term began. "Always need help with the little ones," Miss Porter said. "The ranching families send children of all ages, and one teacher can't manage them all effectively. It would only be mornings, mind you, but every little bit helps a new widow, I expect." By midday, Abigail had secured 2 part-time positions that, together, might just cover her expenses. It wasn't the life she'd once envisioned, the daughter of a Denver merchant. She'd been raised with certain expectations of comfort, but it was honest work that would allow her to care for Sarah. As she walked back toward the hotel, Sarah began to fuss in earnest. Abigail ducked into a small grove of cottonwoods at the edge of town, seeking privacy to feed her daughter. The dappled shade was a relief from the July heat, and Abigail sank onto a fallen log, adjusting her clothing to nurse Sarah. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense. Hastily covering herself, she looked up to see a rider approaching along the creek bank. To her dismay, it was Ross Atkins, leading a packhorse laden with supplies. He reined in sharply when he saw her. "Mrs. Ellis, didn't mean to intrude." "It's all right," she said, though it wasn't. "We were just taking a moment's rest." Ross dismounted but kept a respectful distance. "Pretty spot. Creek runs year-round here, one of the few that does." He glanced at Sarah, now dozing after her meal. "Found what you were looking for in town?" Abigail nodded. "Dr. Simmons has offered me work keeping his records, and Miss Porter may need assistance at the school when term begins. Good folks, both of them." Ross hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Ellis, I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you have any family hereabouts? Anyone to help with the little one while you're working?" The question, though gently asked, pierced Abigail like a physical blow. "No," she said shortly. "It's just us." Ross's brow furrowed. "Raising a child alone isn't easy anywhere but out here." He trailed off, seeming to think better of whatever he was about to say. "Well, if you need help, Independence looks after its own." "We're hardly its own yet," Abigail pointed out. "We've been here less than a day." "Time passes differently out here," Ross said with a small smile. "A week and you'll be an old-timer." Despite herself, Abigail returned his smile. There was something disarming about Ross Atkins, a genuineness that she'd rarely encountered in the men of her acquaintance in Denver. "I should get back," she said, rising from the log. "Sarah will need her nap soon." Ross nodded, moving to help her up but catching himself and stepping back. "Of course. I've got to get these supplies back to the ranch anyway. Mr. Carson doesn't appreciate tardiness." "Carson?" Abigail asked. "The owner of the Double Circle, that's him, James Carson. Built the ranch from nothing 15 years ago. Good man to work for, fair with his hands." Ross gathered his horse's reins. "His wife runs the ranch house like a military operation, but she's got a kind heart under all that efficiency." Abigail nodded, filing away the information. It was good to know who the prominent citizens were in her new home. As Ross mounted his horse, he looked down at her with those clear blue eyes. "Mrs. Ellis, there's a social at the church Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation. Might be a good way to meet some of the townspeople." Abigail hesitated. A social meant questions, curious glances, the potential for her story to unravel. "I'm not sure. Just a thought," Ross said easily. "No pressure, but folks are friendly here. Might make settling in easier." With a tip of his hat, he rode away, the pack-horse plodding behind him. Abigail watched him go, conflicted emotions churning within her. She'd come to Independence to escape scrutiny, not to immerse herself in a new community's curiosity. And yet, she couldn't deny the loneliness that had been her constant companion since discovering her condition nearly a year ago. Back at the hotel, Abigail laid Sarah down for her nap and sat by the window, watching the comings and goings of the town below. Ross Atkins's invitation tugged at her. Perhaps a social wouldn't be the worst idea. She'd need to establish herself as part of the community if she was to build a life here. And it might be good practice maintaining her widow's disguise. By Saturday evening, Abigail had made her decision. Dressed in her one good gown, a dark green cotton with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, and with Sarah in a clean white dress, she made her way to the small white church at the end of Main Street. Lanterns illuminated the churchyard, where tables had been set up and loaded with food. Children ran between the adults, playing tag in the fading light, while a trio of men with a fiddle, guitar, and harmonica provided lively background music. It was a scene of simple community joy, so different from the formal social events of Denver society. "Mrs. Ellis, Dr. Simmons approached, waving a greeting. "Delighted you could join us. Come, let me introduce you to some folks." Before Abigail could protest, she found herself being led through the gathering, presented to what felt like half the town. Ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, the banker and his family all greeted her with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. To her surprise, most seemed to accept her widow's story without question, offering condolences before moving on to more pleasant topics. "And this must be the little Ellis girl," cooed Mrs. Green, the general store owner's wife, peering at Sarah. "What a beautiful child, those eyes, just like sapphires." "Thank you," Abigail said, proudly adjusting Sarah's bonnet. "Her name is Sarah." "A good, strong name," Mrs. Green approved. "How old is she now?" "5 months," Abigail replied truthfully. Mrs. Green's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "5 months. So your husband passed very recently then. You poor dear." Too late, Abigail realized her mistake. If Sarah was 5 months old and her fictional husband had died in Denver before they came to Independence, the timeline was questionable at best. "Yes," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was sudden." Mrs. Green patted her arm sympathetically, but Abigail could see calculation behind her eyes, the mental arithmetic that would expose the lie. Heart pounding, she excused herself, claiming Sarah needed attention. At the edge of the gathering, Abigail took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing pulse. This had been a mistake. She wasn't cut out for deception, and in a small town, inconsistencies in her story would quickly become apparent. "Mrs. Ellis." She turned to find Ross Atkins approaching, looking different than she'd seen him before. He'd cleaned up for the social, his clothes were newer, his hair neatly combed, and he'd shaved the stubble from his jaw, revealing a strong chin with a small cleft in the center. "Mr. Atkins," she greeted him, trying to keep her voice level despite her internal panic. Ross's eyes were concerned. "Everything all right? You look a bit pale." "Just a little overwhelmed," she admitted. It wasn't entirely a lie. He nodded understandingly. Small-town socials can be a lot, everyone wanting to meet the newcomer. Sarah chose that moment to let out a demanding cry. Abigail bounced her gently, but the baby's fussing only increased. "She's probably hungry," Abigail said, embarrassed. "I should take her somewhere quiet." "Pastor's office is empty," Ross suggested. "Through that side door. I can let him know you needed a moment of privacy." Grateful for his understanding, Abigail slipped away to the indicated room. It was small but comfortable, with a desk, bookshelf, and a cushioned chair that Abigail sank into gratefully. As Sarah nursed, Abigail's thoughts raced. Perhaps coming to Independence had been a mistake. Perhaps she should have gone further to California or Oregon, where she could truly start fresh without the need for elaborate lies. A knock at the door made her tense. "Just a moment," she called, quickly adjusting her clothing. Ross's voice came through the door. "It's just me, Mrs. Ellis." Brought you a plate of food, thought you might be hungry." Abigail finished buttoning her bodice. "Come in." The door opened and Ross entered, carefully balancing a plate heaped with fried chicken, cornbread, and beans. He set it on the desk, his eyes politely averted from where she sat with Sarah. "Thank you," Abigail said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gesture. "That was very kind," Ross shrugged. "Seemed like you could use a friendly face." He hesitated, then added, "And maybe someone who won't ask too many questions." Abigail's heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean?" Ross leaned against the desk, his expression gentle but direct. "Mrs. Ellis, Abigail, if I may, I've worked cattle most of my life. Know what it looks like when something's spooked, and you've had that same look since you stepped off that stagecoach." Abigail clutched Sarah tighter, her mind racing for a plausible denial. But exhaustion and the weight of her deception suddenly felt overwhelming. "I'm not sure what you're implying," she said stiffly. Ross sighed. "I'm not implying anything, just offering a friendly ear if you need one. No questions, no judgment." His blue eyes held her steadily. "We all have pasts, Mrs. Ellis. Out here, most folks are more concerned with who you are now than who you were before." The simple kindness in his words nearly undid her. For months, Abigail had faced scorn, judgment, and finally complete ostracism from the people she'd once called friends and family. The idea that someone might accept her regardless of her circumstances seemed too good to be true. "I should return to the social," she said, rising from the chair. "People will wonder." Ross straightened. "Of course, but Mrs. Ellis." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Independence isn't Denver. It's rougher in some ways, but kinder in others. Give us a chance." With that, he held the door for her, and Abigail stepped back into the warm summer evening, Sarah drowsing contentedly in her arms. The music had picked up, and several couples were dancing in a cleared area near the musicians. For the remainder of the evening, Abigail kept to herself, observing more than participating. She noticed how Ross moved easily through the crowd, respected by the men and smiled at by the women. He was clearly well regarded in Independence, comfortable in his place within the community. As the gathering began to disperse, Abigail prepared to walk back to the hotel. To her surprise, Ross approached once more. "Allow me to escort you back, Mrs. Ellis," he said. "It's getting dark." "That's not necessary," Abigail began, but Ross cut her off gently. "Humor me. My mother raised me to see ladies safely home, and she'd haunt me from her grave if I didn't." The walk back to the hotel was quiet, the streets of Independence peaceful under a sky brilliant with stars. Sarah, full and content, slept against Abigail's shoulder. "Did you enjoy the social?" Ross asked as they neared the hotel. "It was informative," Abigail replied honestly. "The people here seem kind." "Most are," Ross agreed. "Like anywhere, we have our share of gossips and troublemakers, but by and large, Independence is full of decent folks just trying to make their way." They reached the hotel entrance, and Abigail turned to face him. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Atkins." "Ross, please," he said. "And it was my pleasure." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said earlier. If you ever need a friend or just someone to talk to, I'm usually around town on Saturdays. Work keeps me at the ranch most other days." Abigail studied him in the moonlight, trying to discern his intentions. Was he merely being kind to a newcomer? Or was there something more behind his offer? Either way, she wasn't in a position to pursue any kind of relationship, friendly or otherwise. Her focus had to be on Sarah and building a stable life. "Good night, Ross," she said finally, "and thank you." He tipped his hat, those blue eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "Good night, Abigail. Sleep well." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Abigail found herself more unsettled than ever. Ross Atkins's kindness was unexpected and in many ways unwelcome. Kindness created obligation, and obligation created connection. Connection was precisely what she'd been trying to avoid. Yet as she lay in bed that night, Sarah sleeping peacefully beside her, Abigail couldn't deny a small, treacherous spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, independence might offer more than merely a hiding place. Perhaps it might, in time, offer a home. The following weeks established a routine for Abigail and Sarah. Afternoons were spent at Dr. Simmons's office, organizing his chaotic records into something approaching a system. The doctor was grateful for her efficiency and had already increased her pay to $4 weekly, recognizing the value she brought to his practice. Mornings were her time with Sarah, often spent walking the quieter streets of Independence or sitting by the creek where they'd encountered Ross. The peaceful spot had become Abigail's favorite retreat, a place to gather her thoughts away from the curious eyes of the townspeople. And there were curious eyes, she knew. Despite her careful maintenance of her widow's story, she'd noticed the speculative glances, the way conversations sometimes hushed when she entered Green's general store. Mrs. Green, in particular, seemed to have taken a keen interest in Abigail's history, asking pointed questions about Denver and her late husband. Ross, true to his word, had not pressed her for details. She saw him occasionally in town on Saturdays, and he always greeted her warmly but respectfully, often stopping to make silly faces at Sarah, who had developed a distinct preference for the Cowboy's company. The baby would light up at the sight of him, waving her little arms and letting out delighted squeals that made Ross beam with pride. "She's getting bigger every time I see her," Ross remarked one Saturday in late August as they stood outside the post office. "Strong, too, by the look of that grip." Indeed, Sarah had latched onto one of Ross's fingers and was holding tight, her blue eyes so like his own. Abigail sometimes thought with a pang fixed on his face in fascination. "She's starting to sit up on her own," Abigail said proudly. "The doctor says she's developing perfectly." "Course she is," Ross said, gently extracting his finger from Sarah's grasp. "Smart as her mother, I'd wager." The compliment brought an unwanted flush to Abigail's cheeks. "How is work at the ranch?" she asked, changing the subject. "Busy. Getting cattle ready for fall drive to the railhead. Mr. Carson's doubled his herd in the last few years. Means more work, but also more pay." He smiled. "Might even take that trip to San Francisco I've been saving for." "San Francisco? What's there?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious. "Ocean, for one thing, never seen it." Ross's expression turned wistful. "My pa used to tell stories about sailing into San Francisco harbor. Said there wasn't a sight like it anywhere in the world." "Your father was a sailor," Ross nodded, "before he took to ranching. Met my mother in California and followed her back to Wyoming." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost them both to influenza when I was 18. Been making my own way since." The admission of his orphan status created an unexpected bond between them. "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. "My parents are gone too. Father passed 5 years ago and mother followed the next winter." "It's a hard country," Ross said simply. "Makes for hard partings." He looked at her directly. "But also new beginnings." The loaded phrase hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. Abigail felt a fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with the warm day. "Yes," she agreed softly. "New beginnings." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion down the street. A wagon had arrived in town, loaded with supplies and driven by a middle-aged couple. What caught everyone's attention, however, was the group of children sitting in the back, at least 6 of them, ranging from infants to teenagers, all looking tired and dusty from travel. "Orphan train," Ross explained, noticing Abigail's confused expression. "Happens a couple times a year. Children from back east, no families to speak of. They bring them out here hoping settlers will take them in." Abigail watched as the children were helped down from the wagon, their meager possessions clutched in small hands or bundled into worn carpetbags. Their faces showed varying degrees of apprehension and hope. "What happens to them?" she asked. "Some get adopted proper by families who can't have children of their own. Others are taken on as help around farms and ranches, the older ones especially." "As servants, you mean?" Abigail said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Ross glanced at her. "Sometimes, but many are treated as part of the family, given education care. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternatives in the city orphanages." The children were being led toward the church, where they would presumably be presented to potential adoptive families. Abigail felt a surge of empathy for them uprooted, traveling to an unknown place, hoping for acceptance. Wasn't that exactly what she and Sarah were doing? "I should get Sarah home for her nap," Abigail said, suddenly eager to hold her daughter close. Ross nodded. "Of course, I've got errands to finish anyway." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Ellis, Miss Sarah." As Abigail walked back to the hotel, Sarah drowsy against her shoulder, she couldn't shake the image of those orphan children. How easily Sarah might have been one of them if circumstances had been just slightly different. If Abigail had succumbed to the pressure to give up her child, to hide her shame in a distant relative's home while her baby was sent to an orphanage or worse. The thought strengthened her resolve. Whatever the difficulties, whatever the judgment she faced, keeping Sarah had been the right choice. Her daughter would know love, even if it came from only one parent. That night, as a late summer thunderstorm rolled across the plains, Abigail sat by the hotel window, watching lightning illuminate the distant mountains. Sarah slept soundly in the small crib Abigail had purchased from a family leaving Independence. The room, though still temporary, had taken on elements of home. A colorful quilt Abigail had sewn from fabric scraps, a small shelf of books, a rocking chair found secondhand where she nursed Sarah in the evenings. A particularly loud crack of thunder shook the building, and Sarah stirred but didn't wake. Abigail smiled at her daughter's ability to sleep through nearly anything. It was a trait that had made their adjustment to independence much easier. A knock at her door startled her. It was nearly 9 in the evening. Who would be calling at this hour? Cautiously, Abigail approached the door. "Who is it?" "Mrs. Parsons, madam. Sorry to disturb you." Abigail opened the door to find the hotel proprietress looking uncharacteristically flustered. "Is something wrong?" "It's one of them orphan-trained children," Mrs. Parsons said in a hushed voice. "A little girl, no more than 3, having some kind of fit downstairs. The lady traveling with them is at her wit's end, and I remembered you mentioning you'd help the doctor." Abigail hesitated, glancing back at Sarah. "I can't leave my daughter." "Bring her along," Mrs. Parsons urged. "The child needs help now. Doctor's been called, but he's out at the Carson Ranch delivering a baby. Won't be back for hours." Decision made, Abigail quickly wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and lifted the still sleeping Sarah. Following Mrs. Parsons downstairs, she found a scene of distress in the lobby. A small girl with auburn hair lay on the settee, her face flushed and body racked with tremors. A harried-looking woman in a plain brown dress was attempting to hold a cool cloth to the child's forehead. "This is Mrs. Ellis," Mrs. Parsons announced. "She works with Dr. Simmons." The woman looked up, desperation clear in her eyes. "Can you help? Mary's fever came on suddenly this afternoon. She was fine at breakfast, but by the time we reached town—" Abigail handed Sarah to Mrs. Parsons and knelt beside the convulsing child. How long has she been seizing like this? About 10 minutes, the woman replied. She's burning up. Abigail felt the child's forehead. Indeed, she was dangerously hot. We need to cool her down immediately. Mrs. Parsons, I need cold water, clean cloths, and if you have any willow bark, we can make a tea to reduce the fever. The doctor keeps medicine here for emergencies, Mrs. Parsons said. In his bag in the back room. Fetch it, please. And I need someone to go to the doctor's office. There's a tincture of feverfew on the second shelf in his cabinet. As Mrs. Parsons rushed to comply, Abigail turned back to the sick child. Mary, can you hear me, sweetheart? The girl's eyes fluttered but didn't focus. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Abigail had seen similar cases in Denver childhood fevers that spiked dangerously high, causing convulsions. The key was reducing the temperature quickly. We need to remove her outer clothing, Abigail told the caretaker, and sponge her with cool, not cold water. Together they worked to make the child more comfortable, applying cool compresses to her forehead, neck, and wrists, the pulse points where cooling would be most effective. When Mrs. Parsons returned with the doctor's bag, Abigail found a mild sedative that would help control the convulsions. I've sent Mr. Parsons for the tincture, Mrs. Parsons reported. Thank you. Abigail carefully administered a small dose of the sedative. This should help ease the seizures. Then we can focus on bringing down the fever. For the next hour, Abigail worked steadily, drawing on the knowledge she'd gained from helping Dr. Simmons and from caring for her own child. Sarah, miraculously, continued to sleep through the commotion, now laid in a makeshift bed of blankets in a corner of the room. Gradually, the little girl's tremors subsided and her breathing became more regular. Her temperature, though still elevated, no longer seemed dangerously high. She's responding, Abigail said, relief evident in her voice. The worst seems to have passed. The caretaker, who had introduced herself as Miss Jenkins, sagged with relief. Thank God, and thank you, Mrs. Ellis. I was terrified we would lose her. Children are remarkably resilient, Abigail said, brushing a damp lock of hair from Mary's forehead. But she'll need careful monitoring through the night. The fever could spike again. I'll stay with her, Miss Jenkins said determinedly. And I'll help, Abigail offered. We can take turns. By dawn, Mary's fever had broken completely. The child was weak but alert, accepting small sips of water and broth. Dr. Simmons, returning from his night call, examined her thoroughly and pronounced Abigail's treatment exactly what he would have prescribed. You've got a natural healing touch, Mrs. Ellis, he said approvingly. Saved this little one a world of suffering. Miss Jenkins was even more effusive in her gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, she said, clasping Abigail's hands in her own. To stay up all night with a stranger's child. Every child deserves care, Abigail said simply. As the sun rose over Independence, Abigail finally returned to her room, exhausted but satisfied. Sarah, who had eventually awakened and been fed during the night, was now playing contentedly with a wooden spoon Mrs. Parsons had provided, seemingly unfazed by the disruption to her routine. Abigail had just settled into her rocking chair, intending to rest for a few moments before beginning the day, when another knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Parsons again, this time looking impressed rather than flustered. Mrs. Ellis, there's someone here to see you. Puzzled, Abigail opened the door wider to find Ross Atkins standing in the hallway, hat in hand. He looked as though he'd ridden hard, his clothes dusty and his expression concerned. Heard about what happened last night, he said without preamble. Came as soon as I could. How's the child? Much better, Abigail said, surprised by his appearance. The fever broke a few hours ago, but how did you hear? You were at the Carson Ranch. Word travels fast, Ross said with a small smile. Mrs. Carson mentioned a sick orphan when she brought breakfast to the bunkhouse. When I heard a Mrs. Ellis had been up all night tending to her, I figured it had to be you. The fact that he'd ridden immediately to town upon hearing the news touched Abigail deeply. That was very thoughtful but unnecessary. Everything is under control now. Ross studied her face. You look exhausted. I am rather tired, Abigail admitted. Then I won't keep you. Just wanted to make sure you and Sarah were all right. His eyes moved to where Sarah sat on the floor, happily gumming the wooden spoon. And to bring you this. From behind his back, Ross produced a small wooden horse, clearly hand-carved and sanded smooth. Made it last week. Thought Sarah might like it when she's a bit older. Abigail accepted the gift, running her fingers over the simple but beautifully crafted toy. You made this, Ross shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Helps pass the time in the evenings, nothing fancy. It's lovely, Abigail said sincerely. Thank you. Ross shifted his weight, seemingly reluctant to leave despite his stated intention not to keep her. Mrs. Carson also mentioned that Miss Jenkins was planning to stay in Independence for a few days, to let Mary recover before continuing on with the orphan train. Yes, Doctor. Simmons advised against travel until Mary regains her strength. The thing is, Ross continued, Mrs. Carson is short-handed with harvest coming. She was wondering if you might be interested in some additional work, helping with the cooking mainly. Would only be for a week or so, but the pay's good. Abigail hesitated. The offer was tempting. Extra money would help her save for more permanent housing than the hotel. But it would mean taking Sarah to an unfamiliar environment, and after a night without sleep, the prospect was daunting. I'm not sure. Sarah would be welcome too, of course, Ross added quickly. Mrs. Carson loves children, had 6 of her own, though they're all grown and moved away now, and the ranch house is comfortable, not fancy, but solid. The earnestness in his expression wore down Abigail's resistance. And practically speaking, the opportunity was too good to pass up. When would Mrs. Carson need me? Soon as you've had some rest, Ross said. I can come back this afternoon with the wagon if that suits. Abigail nodded slowly. I'll need to speak with Dr. Simmons, make arrangements for my absence. Already taken care of, Ross said with a grin. Doc said he could manage for a week without you, though he wasn't happy about it. Said you've organized his office better in a month than he managed in 20 years. Abigail couldn't help but smile at that. Very well then. Sarah and I will be ready by 2 o'clock. As Ross departed, tipping his hat with that now familiar smile, Abigail closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly aware of her racing heart. The prospect of spending time at the Carson Ranch where Ross lived and worked filled her with both anticipation and apprehension. Sarah gurgled happily from her spot on the floor, the wooden spoon forgotten as she reached for her new toy horse. Abigail crossed the room and sat beside her daughter, helping her grasp the smooth wooden animal. What do you think, little one? She asked softly. Are we ready for a new adventure? Sarah's answering smile was all the response she needed. The Carson Ranch was larger than Abigail had anticipated, a sprawling property about 5 miles outside Independence. As Ross drove the wagon up the long approach, Abigail took in the substantial main house, several outbuildings, a large barn and corrals containing horses in various stages of training. In the distance, cattle grazed on seemingly endless pastureland. Mr. Carson started with just 50 head in this house, Ross explained, gesturing to the 2-story structure ahead. Now he runs over 2,000 cattle and owns most of the land you can see from here to those hills. It's impressive, Abigail acknowledged. You've worked here long. Going on 8 years. Started as just another hand, worked my way up to foreman last spring. There was a note of pride in his voice. "Mr. Carson's been good to me, more like family than an employer." The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and a tall, slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged onto the porch. Despite being well into her 50s, Mrs. Carson moved with the energy of a much younger woman. "You must be Mrs. Ellis," she called, descending the steps to meet them. "Margaret Carson, thank you for coming on such short notice." "Thank you for the opportunity," Abigail replied, allowing Ross to help her down from the wagon. "This is my daughter, Sarah." Mrs. Carson's face softened as she looked at the baby. What a beautiful child, those eyes, like a summer sky. She glanced at Ross, then back at Sarah, a speculative expression crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "Well, come in, come in. You must be tired after your night tending to that poor orphan child. Ross told us all about your quick thinking." Inside, the Carson home was comfortable rather than ostentatious practical furniture, clean surfaces, and simple decorations that spoke of a woman who valued function over fashion. Mrs. Carson showed Abigail to a pleasant room on the second floor, with a trundle bed for Sarah and a window overlooking the corral. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Carson informed her. "Rest until then. We'll discuss your duties in the morning." Left alone, Abigail unpacked their few belongings and settled Sarah for a nap. The room was airy and far more spacious than their hotel accommodations. A rocking chair by the window invited Abigail to sit and observe the ranch activities below. She watched as Ross emerged from the barn, deep in conversation with an older man she presumed to be Mr. Carson. There was an ease to his movements, a confidence in his posture that she hadn't fully appreciated in their town encounters. This was his domain, where he was respected and valued. The thought warmed her in an unexpected way. Dinner was a lively affair, with Mr. Carson, a robust man with weathered features and a booming laugh, holding court at the head of the table. Besides the Carsons and Ross, there were two other ranch hands who took their meals in the main house: Hank, the elderly cook who looked relieved at the prospect of Abigail's assistance, and Tom, a fresh-faced young man who managed the ranch books. "Mrs. Ellis here saved an orphan's life last night," Mrs. Carson announced as they passed dishes around the large oak table. "Just applied basic care," Abigail demurred. "Dr. Simmons deserves the credit for having taught me." "Don't sell yourself short," Ross said from across the table. "Doc told me you knew exactly what to do, said he couldn't have done better himself." Mr. Carson raised his water glass. "To Mrs. Ellis, then, Independence's newest guardian angel." The toast sent warmth flooding through Abigail. It had been so long since she'd felt appreciated, valued for something beyond her family connections or social standing. Here, in this frontier ranch house, her actions, her true self, were what mattered. The conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on ranch business, town gossip, and national news that had reached them through the latest newspapers. Abigail, Sarah contentedly on her lap, found herself drawn into discussions about everything from cattle prices to President Grant's policies. "You're well informed, Mrs. Ellis," Mr. Carson remarked when Abigail offered a cogent opinion on recent banking regulations. "Not many ladies take an interest in financial matters. My father was a merchant," Abigail explained. "He believed his daughters should understand business as well as embroidery." "A progressive man," Mrs. Carson approved. "Too many girls are raised to be decorative rather than useful." After dinner, the men moved to the porch to smoke, while Mrs. Carson showed Abigail the kitchen where she would be working. It was a large, well-equipped space with a modern cast-iron stove and ample workspace. "Hank manages breakfast for the hands," Mrs. Carson explained. "You'll help with lunch and dinner preparations. We feed about 15 men total, more when we have extra hands for roundup or harvest. I'm comfortable cooking for large groups, Abigail assured her. My mother hosted frequent dinner parties. Mrs. Carson nodded approvingly. Good. I'll be occupied with harvest accounts this week, so I'll rely on you to manage things here. As they completed the tour, Sarah began to fuss, ready for her evening feeding. Mrs. Carson showed Abigail back to her room. Take your time, the older woman said kindly. The men will be talking cattle and weather for at least an hour. Join us on the porch when you're ready if you like. Alone with Sarah, Abigail settled into the rocking chair to nurse. Through the open window, she could hear the low murmur of male voices from the porch below, occasionally punctuated by Mr. Carson's distinctive laugh. Sarah's eyes were growing heavy when Abigail heard Ross's voice more clearly, directly beneath her window. Finest lady I've ever met. The way she cares for that child after everything. She's certainly educated, came Mr. Carson's reply. Not your typical frontier woman, but there's strength there. You can see it in her eyes. Yes, sir, plenty of strength. There was a pause, then Ross continued, his voice lower. Thing is, I don't think she's a widow at all. Abigail froze, her blood turning to ice. Oh, Mr. Carson sounded curious rather than judgmental. The timing doesn't add up. Child's 5 months old, but she only arrived in Independence a month ago. Claims her husband died in Denver before they came here, but a woman alone with a child, Mr. Carson mused. Not many options for her kind. No, sir. And that's why you think we should mind our own business, Mr. Carson interrupted firmly. Whatever Mrs. Ellis's situation, she's proven herself capable and kind. That's all that matters to me. Yes, sir, Ross agreed quickly. That's exactly what I think too. Abigail's hands trembled as she shifted Sarah to her shoulder. Ross had seen through her story, had probably done so from the beginning, yet he hadn't exposed her. Instead, he'd brought her to the Carson ranch, introduced her to people who might give her more work, more stability. Why? What did he want from her? The question haunted her as she eventually made her way downstairs, Sarah sleeping soundly in her arms. On the porch, Mrs. Carson was sitting in a rocking chair while the men occupied various seats or leaned against the railing. The sunset painted the western sky in dramatic oranges and purples, silhouetting the distant mountains. Ah, Mrs. Ellis, Mr. Carson greeted her. Come enjoy the evening with us. Best view in Wyoming territory, if I do say so myself. Abigail took the empty chair beside Mrs. Carson, consciously avoiding Ross's gaze. It is beautiful, she agreed. So different from Denver. You miss city life? Mrs. Carson asked. Abigail considered the question honestly. Some aspects, the theaters, libraries, but not the people for the most part. Society can be cruel, Mrs. Carson said knowingly. Especially to those who don't conform to expectations. The comment, seemingly innocent, sent another chill through Abigail. Did they all know? Was her shame so transparent? Independence has its advantages, Ross offered. People tend to judge you on what you do, not who your family is or where you came from. Usually, Mr. Carson added with a wry smile, though we have our share of busybodies. Mrs. Green comes to mind. A ripple of laughter passed through the group, easing some of Abigail's tension. The conversation shifted to local matters, the fall cattle drive. The new schoolteacher expected to replace Miss Porter when she retired next year. The proposed railroad spur that might eventually reach Independence. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the porch. One by one, the ranch hands excused themselves, until only the Carsons, Ross, and Abigail remained. I should put Sarah down properly, Abigail said, rising from her chair. The baby had slept through the evening conversation, a warm weight against her chest. Of course, Mrs. Carson said. "Breakfast is at 5:30 for the men, but you're welcome to sleep in. Your duties won't start until 8. Thank you. Good night, then." "I'll walk you up," Ross offered unexpectedly. "Need to check something in the East Wing anyway." Before Abigail could decline, he was opening the door for her. With the Carsons watching, she had little choice but to accept his escort. They climbed the stairs in silence, the only sound the creak of floorboards beneath their feet. At her door, Abigail turned to face him, determined to maintain her composure despite knowing he'd seen through her charade. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Good night." Ross made no move to leave. "Abigail," he said quietly, "I want you to know that your secret is safe with me." So he was going to acknowledge it directly. Abigail steeled herself. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." His voice was gentle but firm. "And I want you to know it doesn't matter to me. Whatever happened in Denver, whoever Sarah's father might be, it changes nothing about who you are now." Abigail's carefully constructed defenses began to crack. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered. "I know you stayed up all night caring for a stranger's child. I know you're working 2 jobs to provide for your daughter. I know you faced judgment and hardship, yet you still have kindness for others." Ross took a step closer. "I know enough, Abigail." Tears threatened, and Abigail blinked rapidly to contain them. "Why are you doing this? Why bring me here, help me, when you know I've been lying?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Ross said simply, "and because I—" He hesitated, then continued more softly. "Because from the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, holding your daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world, I knew you were someone special." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implications. Abigail's heart raced. "Ross, I can't. Sarah and I'm not asking for anything," he assured her quickly. "Just wanted you to know you don't have to pretend around me, or the Carsons for that matter. They've guessed too, but they're good people. They won't spread gossip." Relief and anxiety warred within Abigail. To be known, truly known, was both terrifying and liberating. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for your discretion." Ross nodded, his expression softening. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's likely to be busy." He hesitated, then added, "And Abigail, this baby will know only pride in her mother's courage and in herself. I promise you that." The words, spoken with such conviction, broke the dam of Abigail's emotions. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Ross reached out tentatively, his thumb brushing the tear away. The brief contact sent warmth cascading through her. "Good night, Abigail," he said, his voice husky. "Good night, Ross," she whispered. As his footsteps retreated down the hallway, Abigail leaned against her door, Sarah still sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time in nearly a year, she felt the weight of her shame beginning to lift. In its place was something fragile but unmistakable: hope. The week at the Carson ranch passed in a blur of activity. True to Mrs. Carson's word, the harvest required all hands, including the women of the house. Abigail found herself rising before dawn to help prepare massive breakfasts for hungry workers, spending midday preserving the garden's bounty for winter, and ending each day exhausted but satisfied. Sarah thrived in the ranch environment. Mrs. Carson doted on her, often carrying her around the garden or sitting with her on the porch while Abigail worked in the kitchen. Even Mr. Carson, gruff though he could be, was known to bounce the baby on his knee, singing off key trail songs that made Sarah giggle. And then there was Ross. True to his word, he asked nothing of Abigail, made no overtures beyond friendship. Yet she felt his presence acutely wherever she went, his easy smile when their paths crossed in the yard, his quiet thank you at mealtimes, the way his eyes found hers across the dinner table. There was a gentle courtship happening, Unspoken but undeniable, on Abigail's final evening at the ranch, Mrs. Carson presented her with an envelope. "Your wages, Mrs. Ellis, with a little extra for the exceptional quality of your work." Abigail opened the envelope to find $15, a princely sum for a week's labor. "Mrs. Carson, this is too generous." "Nonsense. You earned every penny." The older woman hesitated, then added, "And there's something else James and I would like to discuss with you." They moved to Mr. Carson's study, where the rancher was reviewing accounts. He looked up as they entered, removing his spectacles. "Ah, Mrs. Ellis. Margaret told you we wanted a word." "Yes, sir." Mr. Carson gestured for her to sit. "Been thinking about your situation." "Margaret and I, that is. We understand you're living at the hotel in town." "For now, yes," Abigail confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "Not ideal for a young mother and child," Mrs. Carson said, taking a seat beside her husband. "Hotels are for travelers, not for putting down roots." "I'm saving for a small house," Abigail explained. "Dr. Simmons has been very generous with my wages, and with the school position starting next month, we have a proposition for you," Mr. Carson interrupted. "We own a small cabin about a quarter-mile from here. Used to house our foreman before we built the addition to the main house. It's been sitting empty since." Abigail's pulse quickened. "A cabin. Nothing fancy," Mrs. Carson cautioned. "2 rooms, a small kitchen, but solid construction, a good roof. It would be yours, rent-free, in exchange for continued help with cooking and household management." "The arrangement would be flexible," Mr. Carson added. "You could maintain your position with Dr. Simmons and the teaching work when it begins. We'd only need your help here 2 or 3 days a week, primarily when we have extra hands during busy seasons." Abigail was speechless. The offer was incredibly generous, a home of her own, additional income, all while maintaining her independence and existing work. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why would you do this for us?" Mr. Carson exchanged a glance with his wife. "Mrs. Ellis, Abigail, we've raised 6 children on this ranch. They've all moved on to their own lives, their own families. This house was built for noise and activity, not for 2 old folks rattling around. Having you and Sarah here this week has been a joy," Mrs. Carson added. "And practically speaking, I'm not getting any younger. Managing this house and feeding the hands is becoming more difficult each year. And if I'm being completely honest," Mr. Carson continued with a small smile, "a certain foreman of mine has made it clear that your continued presence in the area would be highly appreciated." Heat rushed to Abigail's face. "Ross spoke to you about me." "Not directly, Mrs. Carson assured her. "But we've known that boy for 8 years. Never seen him so attentive to a lady's comfort, nor so quick to volunteer for town errands since you arrived in Independence." The implication was clear, and Abigail's heart fluttered traitorously. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Mr. Carson suggested. "Take your time, the cabin isn't going anywhere. And regardless of your decision," Mrs. Carson added, "know that you and Sarah are always welcome here." Emotion welled in Abigail's throat. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll think about it carefully." Later that night, Abigail sat in her room, Sarah sleeping peacefully in the trundle bed. The Carsons' offer replayed in her mind, its generosity almost overwhelming. A home of her own, a real home, not a hotel room. A place where Sarah could grow up with space to play, fresh air to breathe, away from the confines of town, and proximity to Ross. The thought sent a jolt through her. Was that influencing her consideration? The possibility of developing whatever was growing between them? It would be foolish to make such a significant decision based on a man's attention, no matter how genuine it seemed. And yet, a soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Rising quietly to avoid waking Sarah, Abigail opened it to find Ross standing in the hallway. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly, "but I wanted to speak with you before you return to town tomorrow." Abigail glanced at Sarah, still sleeping soundly. "Let me get my shawl. We can talk on the porch." The night was cool but not cold, the sky ablaze with stars. They settled into the rocking chairs side by side, the ranch quiet around them save for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures. "The Carsons made you an offer," Ross said without preamble. "About the cabin." "They told you," he nodded. "Asked my opinion first, actually. Wanted to make sure I wasn't planning to use it myself." "And are you?" Abigail asked. "No, I'm comfortable in the bunkhouse, for now anyway." There was something in the way he said it that made Abigail's pulse quicken. "Are you considering it? Their offer?" "It's very generous," Abigail said carefully. "Almost too generous, to be honest. I can't help feeling there must be a catch." Ross chuckled softly. "No catch. The Carsons are just like that. They see someone in need, someone of good character, and they help. Did the same for me when I was 18 and had nowhere to go. They mentioned that you might have influenced their decision." Even in the dim light, Abigail could see color rise in Ross's cheeks. "Did they now? Meddling old," he cut himself off, clearing his throat. "I may have mentioned that it seemed a shame for you and Sarah to be cooped up in that hotel room, that's all." Abigail smiled, finding his discomfort endearing. "Is that all?" Ross met her gaze directly. "No," he admitted. "That's not all." He took a deep breath. "Abigail, I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you've been through hardships I can only imagine. But in the time since you arrived in Independence, I've come to care for you, and for Sarah." The simple declaration, spoken without flourish, touched Abigail deeply. "Ross, please, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for anything from you I understand you might not be ready for any kind of attachment. But I want you to know that if you decide to take the Carsons' offer, it doesn't come with any expectations from me. And if you decide not to, well, that won't change my feelings either." "What are your feelings?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ross leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "I think you're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met. I think Sarah is the luckiest little girl in Wyoming to have you as her mother. And I think, if you'd allow it, I'd like to court you properly. Slowly, respectfully, at whatever pace feels right to you." Abigail's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her with such honesty, such directness. Even Sarah's father, with all his pretty words and promises, had never truly seen her as Ross seemed to. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "There's so much you don't know about me, about my past." "I know everything I need to know," Ross assured her. "The rest you can tell me if and when you choose to. There's no rush, Abigail. I'm a patient man." The sincerity in his voice, the steady warmth in his eyes broke down the final barriers around Abigail's heart. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to accept the Carsons' offer. For Sarah's sake primarily, but also—" She took a deep breath. "Also because the thought of being near you more often is not unpleasant." Ross's smile was like the sunrise, gradual, then brilliant. "Not unpleasant," he repeated. "High praise indeed, Mrs. Ellis." "Abigail," she corrected softly. "If you're going to court me, you should use my given name." "Abigail," he agreed, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. His touch was warm, calloused from years of ranch work, but gentle as he enfolded her fingers in his. "And what about Sarah's sake? Would it be too presumptuous to hope that someday she might come to see me as more than just a friend of her mother's?" The question, so carefully phrased, brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "I think Sarah would be very fortunate to have you in her life, Ross. In whatever capacity that might eventually become." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, hands still joined, each lost in their own thoughts about the future, a future that suddenly held possibilities neither had dared to imagine mere weeks before. "It's getting late," Abigail said finally, "and tomorrow we'll be busy moving our things to the cabin." Ross squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "I'll help with that, and with any repairs or improvements the cabin might need. Been empty for a while, might need a woman's touch." The idea of making the cabin her own, her first true home as an independent woman, filled Abigail with unexpected excitement. "I look forward to seeing it." As they rose to go inside, Ross paused at the porch steps. "Abigail," he said, his voice serious, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens between us, whether this courtship leads where I hope it might or not, I meant what I said about Sarah. That child will know only pride in herself and in her remarkable mother. I promise you that." In the starlight, with the vast Wyoming sky spread above them, and the promise of a new beginning before them, Abigail believed him. 2 months later, as October painted the landscape in russet and gold, Abigail stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching Sarah crawl enthusiastically across the braided rug she'd finished the previous week. The cabin had been transformed from a utilitarian bachelor's quarters to a warm, inviting home. Curtains adorned the windows, a comfortable settee faced the stone fireplace, and Sarah's crib, hand-built by Ross, occupied a corner of the main room. Life had settled into a pleasant rhythm. 3 days a week, Abigail worked for Dr. Simmons in town. 2 days she assisted Mrs. Carson at the main house, and 2 precious days were reserved for her own small family, just her and Sarah, with increasingly regular visits from Ross. Their courtship had progressed slowly but steadily. Ross respected Abigail's need for caution, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They shared meals, took walks along the creek with Sarah, and gradually, Abigail found herself sharing pieces of her past, her childhood in Denver, her parents' expectations, and eventually, the circumstances that had led to her flight from the city. Ross had listened without judgment as she told him about Sarah's father, the charming banker's son who had promised marriage, then disappeared when she told him she was expecting his child. About her parents' friends, who had suggested a discreet visit to relatives until the baby could be given up for adoption. About her decision to keep her child, despite the social consequences and the subsequent ostracism that had driven her to seek a new beginning in Wyoming. "You're the bravest person I know," Ross had said simply when she finished her story, "and I'm honored you trusted me enough to share it." Now, watching Sarah explore her surroundings with the boundless curiosity of a 9-month-old, Abigail felt a contentment she hadn't thought possible a year ago. The shame that had once been her constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet pride in the life she was building. The sound of hoofbeats announced a visitor. Through the window, Abigail saw Ross approaching on his bay gelding. Sarah, recognizing the sound, sat up with a happy squeal. "Yes, it's Ross," Abigail told her daughter, smiling at the baby's obvious delight. Sarah adored Ross, breaking into wide grins whenever he appeared and reaching for him with chubby, demanding arms. The door opened after a cursory knock, and Ross stepped inside, bringing the crisp autumn air with him. "Afternoon, ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just watching this one discover that rug fringes are fascinating," Abigail said, gesturing to where Sarah had returned to her exploration. "What brings you by? I thought you were helping with the cattle drive preparations. Finished early. And I wanted to speak with you about something." Ross seemed uncharacteristically nervous, shifting his hat in his hands. Thought we might take a walk if you're not too busy. Curiosity piqued, Abigail nodded. Let me wrap Sarah up. It's getting chilly out there. Soon they were strolling along the creek path, Sarah bundled against Abigail's chest in a sling. The aspens were at their golden peak, leaves shimmering in the afternoon sunlight. Beautiful day, Ross commented, his gaze on the distant mountains. It is, Abigail agreed, wondering what was on his mind. Ross, is everything all right? You seem distracted. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Sorry, just trying to find the right words. He took a deep breath. Abigail, these past months getting to know you and Sarah, watching you make a place for yourselves here, they've been the happiest of my life. Abigail's heart began to race. They've been wonderful for us too. I've been saving, Ross continued, for years now. Originally for that trip to San Francisco to see the ocean like my pa did. He smiled ruefully. Funny how dreams change. Now all I can think about is building a life here, with you and Sarah. Ross, please let me get this out before I lose my nerve. He took her hands in his. I love you, Abigail. I love Sarah as if she were my own. And if you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of you both. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, spilling over before she could contain them. Oh, Ross. Concern crossed his features. I'm sorry if this is too soon. We can wait, take more time. No, Abigail interrupted, squeezing his hands. It's not too soon. It's perfect. Yes, Ross. Yes, I'll marry you. Joy transformed his face, erasing the anxiety that had lined it moments before. You will. I will. Abigail laughed through her tears. I love you too, you know. Have for some time now. Ross's answering smile was radiant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Abigail met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, full of promise. When they parted, Ross rested his forehead against hers. I don't have much to offer yet. Been talking with Mr. Carson about purchasing a small parcel of land adjacent to the ranch. Could build us a proper house there in time. I don't need a grand house, Abigail assured him. Just you and a safe place for Sarah to grow up. At the sound of her name, Sarah let out a happy gurgle, reaching a chubby hand toward Ross. He laughed, stepping back to take the baby's fingers in his. What do you think, little miss? Will you put up with me as a pa? The words, so casually spoken, yet so profound in its implications, brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes. She adores you already, she said softly. As do I. Ross's expression grew serious. Abigail, I want you to know I'll legally adopt Sarah if you'll allow it. She'll have my name, my protection, everything I can give her. You would do that, Abigail whispered, overcome by his generosity. In a heartbeat, Ross said firmly. She's part of you, which makes her part of me. This baby will know only pride in who she is and where she comes from. Both her mother's courage and her father's love. Her father's love, Abigail repeated, the words filling a void she hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Yes, I think she'd like that very much. They were married a month later in the Independence Church, with the Carsons standing as witnesses and Dr. Simmons giving the bride away. Sarah, resplendent in a white dress Mrs. Carson had sewn for the occasion, was passed from one adoring set of arms to another throughout the reception at the Carson Ranch. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, the little family established their routine in the cabin, which now felt perfectly sized for their needs. Ross moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse, adding his books to Abigail's small collection and his guitar to the corner by the fireplace. Each evening, he would play softly as Abigail rocked Sarah to sleep, the melodies becoming part of their daughter's earliest memories. Their life together wasn't without challenges. The winter of 1876-77 proved particularly harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Abigail's work in town had to be suspended until the roads cleared, and even trips to the main ranch house were sometimes impossible. Yet within their snug cabin, with the fireplace blazing and Sarah taking her first tentative steps across the braided rug, they found a contentment that needed no outside validation. By spring, two significant changes had occurred in their lives. First, with Mr. Carson's blessing and financial backing, Ross had purchased 20 acres of prime ranch land, with plans to start building their own home that summer. Second, and more surprisingly to Abigail, she discovered she was expecting their first child together. "Are you pleased?" she asked Ross nervously after sharing the news one evening in April. "It's sooner than we planned." Ross's answer was to sweep her into an embrace that left no doubt of his joy. "Pleased? Abigail, I'm ecstatic. Sarah will have a brother or sister, and we'll have another little one to love." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child, a piece of both of us. Our family is growing faster than our house," Abigail teased, though privately she shared his excitement. The idea of Sarah having siblings, of experiencing the kind of normal family life Abigail had feared might be forever denied to her, filled her with profound gratitude. Summer brought the construction of their new home, a modest but well-built four-room house on their own land, with large windows to capture the mountain views and a wide front porch where, Ross declared, he intended to rock their children for years to come. Abigail, her condition now visible beneath her loosened dresses, supervised the interior details while continuing her work for Dr. Simmons 2 days a week. By October, as they prepared to move into their completed home, Abigail was 8 months along and feeling the weight of impending motherhood both literally and figuratively. Sarah, now walking confidently and beginning to form words, was fascinated by her mother's changing body, patting Abigail's rounded stomach and saying "baby" with solemn importance. "She's going to be a wonderful big sister," Ross observed as they packed their belongings in the cabin. "Already so protective. She takes after her father that way," Abigail replied with a smile, "always looking out for others." Ross paused in his task, coming to place his hands on her shoulders. "Have I told you lately how happy you've made me, Abigail Atkins?" The name still gave her a thrill, not because it represented respectability in the eyes of society, but because it represented belonging. To Ross, to independence, to the life they were building together. "Only about 10 times today," she teased, "but I don't mind hearing it again." "Well then, let me be perfectly clear," Ross said, his eyes warm with affection. "You and Sarah are the best things that ever happened to me. And this new little one," he placed a hand on her belly where their child kicked vigorously, "is the continuation of a blessing I never thought I'd be fortunate enough to receive, even when you have to get up in the night with a fussy baby." Abigail challenged, remembering the nights Ross had walked a teething Sarah while Abigail rested. "Even then," he assured her, "every moment, good and challenging, is a gift because it's with you." Their son, James Ross Atkins, arrived on a clear November morning as the first snow dusted the peaks of the distant mountains. Unlike Sarah's birth, a frightening, lonely experience in a Denver boarding house, James came into the world surrounded by love. Ross held Abigail's hand throughout her labor, Dr. Simmons attended with calm efficiency, and Mrs. Carson took charge of young Sarah, bringing her to meet her brother once the exhausting work was done. "He's red," Sarah observed seriously, peering at the newborn in Abigail's arms. Ross chuckled, lifting his daughter to get a better view. "All babies are red at first, Pumpkin. He'll look more like you and Mama soon enough." Sarah considered this information, then reached out a careful finger to touch the baby's cheek. "My brother," she declared with the certainty of a 20-month-old. "That's right," Abigail confirmed, tears of joy threatening. "Your brother Jamie," Sarah decided, the adult name apparently too cumbersome for her liking. Ross and Abigail exchanged amused glances over their children's heads. "Jamie it is," Ross agreed, and the name stuck. That night, with Sarah finally asleep in her new room and Jamie nursing contentedly beside her in the bed she shared with Ross, Abigail felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find. From the shame and fear that had driven her to independence just over a year ago, she had found her way to this moment of perfect peace: a husband who adored her, a daughter who was thriving, a son who represented new beginnings, and a community that had accepted her for who she was, not who she had pretended to be. "What are you thinking about?" Ross asked softly, noticing her pensive expression in the lamplight. "About how far we've come," Abigail replied. "About how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been there the day I arrived, or if you had been someone else, someone less kind, less understanding." Ross reached out to stroke Jamie's downy head, then traced Abigail's cheek with gentle fingers. "I think some things are meant to be, Abigail, not in a fatalistic way, but in the sense that when two people are right for each other, the world finds ways to bring them together." "A romantic cowboy," Abigail teased. "Who would have thought? Only with you," he assured her with a grin. "To everyone else, I'm still the serious, practical foreman they've always known." "Your secret is safe with me," Abigail promised, leaning over to kiss him softly. "Along with my heart." Ross's arms encircled her and their newborn, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. "Sleep now," he murmured. "Tomorrow's the beginning of our next chapter." As Abigail drifted toward sleep, Jamie secure against her chest and Ross's steady breathing beside her, she reflected on the words Ross had spoken that first day on the porch of their cabin. "This baby will know only pride." He had kept that promise, not just for Sarah but for all of them. In place of shame, they had built pride in their family, in their home, in the love that had transformed them from strangers into something unbreakable. Outside, the first significant snowfall of the winter began to blanket their new home, insulating it against the cold months ahead. But within, the warmth of their family, unexpected, unconventional, but undeniably real, would carry them through whatever challenges awaited. Together. Epilogue: 10 years later, 1886. The Independence town square was festooned with red, white, and blue bunting, the 4th of July celebration in full swing despite the morning's brief thundershower. Children ran between the booths selling pies, candies, and handicrafts, their excited voices carrying across the crowded green. Abigail Atkins stood beside the schoolhouse booth, where students' artwork was displayed for proud parents to admire. At 32, with the passing of a decade, she remained striking, her chestnut hair now styled in a more practical fashion, laugh lines beginning to form at the corners of her eyes, her figure slightly fuller after bearing 3 children. "Mama, look what I won." 8-year-old Jamie came racing up, brandishing a small carved horse. Mr. Green said my throw was the best he'd seen all day. "Wonderful, darling," Abigail praised him, straightening his collar automatically. "Where are your sister and brother?" "Sarah's watching the pie-eating contest with Ruth Carson," Jamie reported. "And Pa took Tommy to see the new foals Mr. Sanders brought in." "Of course he did," Abigail said with a fond smile. Ross and their youngest, 4-year-old Thomas, shared an insatiable fascination with horses. "Don't go too far. The speeches will be starting soon and your father's expected to say a few words." Jamie made a face. "Do we have to listen to speeches?" Billy Thompson said there's going to be a greased pig contest after lunch. Your father is the mayor now, Abigail reminded him gently. It would be disrespectful not to attend. Still grumbling, Jamie ran off to find his friends, his prize clutched tightly in his hand. Abigail shook her head, amused by his boundless energy. Mrs. Atkins, Dr. Simmons approached, his step slower than 10 years ago but his mind still sharp. Your student's work is excellent as always. That landscape by young Susie Miller shows real talent. Thank you, Doctor. Susie has a natural eye for composition. Abigail had taken over as Independence's schoolteacher 5 years earlier, when Miss Porter finally retired. The position suited her perfectly, allowing her to be home when her children returned from school and giving her the intellectual stimulation she craved. "Have you seen Ross?" the doctor inquired. "Wanted to congratulate him on that speech he's giving today." "Never thought I'd see the day a former cattle hand became mayor of Independence." "He's around somewhere with Tommy," Abigail replied, "and he's nervous about the speech, though he'd never admit it. 10 years in Wyoming, and he still claims public speaking is harder than breaking wild horses." Doctor Simmons chuckled. "Some things never change. Speaking of which, how's Sarah doing at that boarding school in Denver? Must be strange having her away from home." A bittersweet smile crossed Abigail's face. "It is. The house feels emptier without her, but she's thriving academically. Her letters are full of her studies and new friends." She lowered her voice slightly. "And Ross is already plotting to bring her home if any young men show too much interest. Protective fathers never change, regardless of the century," Dr. Simmons observed. "She's what now, 15? Beautiful age." "Nearly 16, Abigail corrected. "And yes, she's beautiful. Takes after her father." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. Over the years, as Sarah had grown to resemble neither Abigail nor Ross in any marked way, there had been occasional speculation about her parentage. But Independence had largely accepted the Atkins family as they presented themselves, and if anyone harbored suspicions about Sarah's origins, they kept them private out of respect for the mayor and his wife. "Ah, there he is now, Doctor," Simmons said, nodding toward the edge of the square where Ross was approaching. Tommy perched on his shoulders. At 42, Ross Atkins had matured from a handsome young cowboy into a distinguished community leader. His sandy hair was now threaded with silver at the temples, and the responsibilities of ranching and civic duty had added gravity to his bearing. But his blue eyes still crinkled at the corners when he smiled, especially at the sight of his wife. "There's my beautiful wife," Ross called as he drew near. "Tommy and I have been admiring the finest horseflesh in 3 counties." "So I heard," Abigail replied, reaching up to help Tommy down from his perch. "And getting thoroughly dusty in the process, I see." Tommy, a miniature version of his father right down to the cleft in his chin, grinned unrepentantly. "Pa says a little dust never hurt anyone." "Your father says many things," Abigail said dryly, brushing at the boy's rumpled clothing. "Some more practical than others." Ross laughed, pulling her in for a quick kiss. "You married a cowboy, Mrs. Atkins. Dust comes with the territory." "Along with inappropriate public displays of affection, apparently," she retorted, but her eyes were warm with affection. Even after 9 years of marriage, Ross could still make her heart beat faster with a simple touch. "It's a holiday," Ross defended himself. "Rules are relaxed." He glanced at the town clock. "Speaking of which, I should probably review my notes before the speeches begin. Where are Sarah and Jamie?" "Sarah's with Ruth, and Jamie's likely trying to convince his friends he can catch that greased pig single-handedly," Abigail informed him. "I'll round them up. You go prepare." As Ross headed toward the makeshift podium at the center of the square, Tommy firmly in hand, Dr. Simmons gave Abigail a knowing smile. "You two still act like newlyweds even after all these years," he observed. "It's refreshing to see." Abigail felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "He makes it easy to love him," she said simply. "The best ones do," the doctor agreed. "Well, I'll help you locate your wayward children. Can't have the mayor's family absent for his big moment." 20 minutes later, Abigail sat in the front row with all three children beside her, Jamie fidgeting impatiently, Tommy half asleep in the midday heat, and Sarah sitting straight and proud in her boarding school dress, looking every inch the young lady she was becoming. The Independence Town Band had just finished a somewhat ragged rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, and the town council chairman was introducing Ross. "Citizens of Independence," Ross began, his deep voice carrying easily across the square. 10 years ago, I was just a ranch hand with dirt under my nails and not much to my name except a good horse and a dream or two. Today, I stand before you as your mayor, which just goes to show that in America, and especially here in Wyoming territory, anything is possible if you're willing to work for it." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Ross had been elected on a platform of practical improvements, better roads, a proper school building, advocacy for the railroad spur that would finally connect Independence to the main line. But it was his personal story that had resonated with voters. The orphaned cowboy who had worked his way up to ranch foreman, then small rancher in his own right, and now civic leader, embodied the frontier spirit they all admired. We're celebrating today the birth of our nation, a nation founded on the principle that all people are created equal and deserve an equal chance at happiness, Ross continued. Here in Independence, we strive to make that principle a reality. We welcome newcomers, we help neighbors in need, and we judge people by their actions, not by their origins or circumstances. Abigail felt Sarah stiffen slightly beside her. At nearly 16, her daughter was increasingly aware of the questions surrounding her birth, questions that, despite Ross's legal adoption and unwavering love, occasionally caused painful moments of self-doubt. "I'm particularly proud that Wyoming has led the way in recognizing women's right to vote," Ross went on, his gaze finding Abigail in the crowd. "Our territory understood 16 years ago what the rest of the nation is still figuring out, that women's contributions to our communities are invaluable and deserve equal recognition." A cheer went up from the assembled women, who had indeed been voting in Wyoming territorial elections since 1870. Abigail smiled, recalling how proudly she had cast her first ballot with Ross by her side, Sarah in her arms, and Jamie not yet born. "Independence has come a long way in the decade I've called it home," Ross said, his voice growing more personal. "We've weathered hard winters, dry summers, economic setbacks, and personal losses together. We've celebrated births, marriages, and achievements as one community. And we've grown from a dusty cattle town to a thriving center of commerce and education." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, acknowledging familiar faces with a nod or smile. "But what makes Independence special isn't our buildings or businesses. It's our people. People who believe in second chances and new beginnings. People who understand that mistakes and hardships don't define a person, it's what you do afterward that matters." Abigail felt tears gathering in her eyes, knowing these words were as much for her as for the general audience. Ross had given her that second chance, that new beginning, when she needed it most. "As we look to the future," Ross concluded, "let's remember what brought many of us to this frontier in the first place, the hope for a better life, not just for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. Let's continue to build a community where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, where differences are respected, and where no one faces judgment for circumstances beyond their control. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, the citizens of Independence rising to their feet in approval. Abigail stood with them, pride swelling in her chest as she watched her husband acknowledge the reception with a modest nod. "Pa's really good at speeches," Jamie commented, temporarily forgetting his impatience for the festivities to resume. "Yes, he is," Abigail agreed, squeezing her son's shoulder affectionately. As the crowd began to disperse for the afternoon activities, Sarah turned to her mother, an unusual seriousness in her expression. "Mama, can we talk alone?" Abigail felt a flicker of apprehension but nodded. "Of course." "Why don't we walk to the creek? I'll ask your father to keep an eye on the boys." After a brief conversation with Ross, who was being congratulated by town council members, Abigail and Sarah made their way out of the square toward the same creek where Abigail had once sought privacy to nurse her infant daughter. Now that daughter walked beside her tall, graceful, with auburn hair that fell in waves down her back and eyes the color of a summer sky. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Abigail asked when they reached the familiar stand of cottonwoods, now considerably larger than they had been a decade earlier. Sarah hesitated, twisting her hands nervously in front of her. "In Denver, at school, the girls talk about their families a lot, about resemblances, who has their mother's eyes or their father's laugh." Abigail's heart constricted. This conversation had been inevitable, but she'd hoped to have it with Ross present. "And this bothers you?" "Not exactly bothers," Sarah clarified, "but it makes me think about my real father." She looked up, meeting Abigail's gaze directly. "I know Pa Ross isn't my biological father. I've known for a while. I don't look like either of you, and I've overheard things over the years." Abigail took a deep breath. "I should have spoken to you about this sooner," she acknowledged. "You're right. Ross isn't your biological father, but Sarah, he is your father in every way that matters. He has loved you as his own from the moment he met you." "I know that," Sarah said quickly. "I'm not questioning his love or yours. I wonder sometimes about where I come from, who I might resemble." Abigail gestured to a fallen log, the same one, perhaps, where she had sat nursing Sarah on the day Ross had found them there. They sat side by side, the creek bubbling peacefully nearby. "Your biological father was a man named Edward Blackburn," Abigail began, the name still difficult to speak after all these years. "His family owned a bank in Denver. We met at a social event when I was 19. He was charming, attentive, everything a young woman is taught to desire in a suitor." Sarah listened intently, her expression serious beyond her years. "He courted me for several months, promised marriage, made me believe he loved me." Abigail sighed. "When I told him I was expecting you, he disappeared, left Denver with a substantial amount of his family's money. His parents disowned him publicly and made it clear that I and my situation were unwelcome reminders of their son's disgrace." "So he never even saw me?" Sarah asked, a hint of hurt in her voice. "No, sweetheart. He was gone before you were born." Abigail reached for her daughter's hand. "But his loss was immeasurable. He never knew the amazing person you would become." Sarah absorbed this information silently. Then, "Did you love him?" The question caught Abigail off guard. "I thought I did at the time. But looking back, I realize I was infatuated with the idea of him, the handsome banker's son who seemed to offer security and social standing. It wasn't real love, not like what I found later with Ross." "Is that why you came to Independence? Because of the scandal?" Abigail nodded. "Denver society can be unforgiving. Unmarried mothers are considered disgraced. I couldn't bear the thought of raising you in an environment where you'd be judged for circumstances that were never your fault. And then you met Pa, Sarah said, a small smile finally breaking through her serious expression. Yes, he was waiting at the stagecoach when we arrived, though neither of us knew then how important we would become to each other. Abigail squeezed her daughter's hand. From the very beginning, Ross saw you as special, Sarah. Not as evidence of shame or scandal, but as a precious child deserving of love and pride. He told me once, Sarah said quietly, that I was his daughter in his heart from the first moment he saw me. I thought he was just being sentimental, but he meant it literally, didn't he? He did, Abigail confirmed. Ross has never seen you as anything but his daughter. The adoption merely made legal what was already true in his heart. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she asked, "Does it bother you that I might wonder about my biological father? I don't want to hurt Pa's feelings or yours." "Oh, Sarah," Abigail pulled her daughter into an embrace. "It's perfectly natural to be curious about your origins. Ross and I have always expected that you would have questioned someday. It doesn't diminish your love for us or ours for you." "Good," Sarah said, returning the embrace. "Because I have the best father in the world even if we don't share blood, and the best mother too." She pulled back, wiping away a few tears. "I just wanted to understand the whole story." "And you deserve to know it," Abigail assured her. "Is there anything else you want to ask? Anything I haven't explained clearly enough?" Sarah shook her head. "Not right now, maybe later." She stood, smoothing her dress. "We should get back. The fireworks will be starting soon and Jamie will never forgive us if we miss them." As they walked back toward town, Sarah slipped her arm through her mother's, a gesture more appropriate between adult friends than mother and child, but one that felt right in this moment of new understanding. "Mama," Sarah said as the town square came back into view, the evening festivities now in full swing with lanterns illuminating the gathering darkness. "Thank you for keeping me, for being brave enough to start over in a new place, just to give me a good life." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. "Sarah, you were never a burden to be kept. You are the greatest gift of my life. Everything good that has happened to me began with you." Sarah smiled, a woman's wisdom in a girl's face. "Like Pa always says in Independence, we get to choose what defines us. Not our past or other people's judgments, but the lives we build and the love we share." "When did you get so wise?" Abigail asked, pride swelling in her heart. "I had good teachers," Sarah replied simply. They rejoined the family near the bandstand, where Ross was holding a sleepy Tommy while Jamie excitedly explained the greased pig contest, which he had not, in fact, won, much to his chagrin. At the sight of his wife and eldest child, Ross's face lit with the smile that, even after a decade, still made Abigail's heart skip a beat. "There you are," he greeted them, shifting Tommy to his other arm. "Everything all right?" Sarah answered by hugging him fiercely, nearly dislodging her younger brother in the process. "Everything's perfect, Pa. Your speech was wonderful." Ross's eyes met Abigail's over their daughter's head, a silent question in them. Abigail nodded slightly, confirming that the conversation had gone well. "Well, thank you, Princess," Ross said, his free arm holding Sarah close. "Means a lot coming from my harshest critic." "I'm not that harsh," Sarah protested, falling back into their familiar teasing rhythm. "Last month you told me my proposal for the new bridge was pedestrian and lacking vision," Ross reminded her with mock offense. "And you revised it, and now it's much better," Sarah pointed out. "You're welcome." Ross laughed, the sound merging with the music and conversation around them. "Can't argue with that logic. Must get her intelligence from her mother," he added to Dr. Simmons, who had joined their group. Along with her stubbornness, Abigail retorted good-naturedly, "The rest is all Atkins." The first firework exploded overhead, drawing exclamations of delight from the crowd. As red and blue sparks rained down against the night sky, Ross put his arm around Abigail's waist, drawing her close to his side. Their children, Sarah now holding Tommy so he could see better, Jamie whooping with each new explosion, stood before them, their faces illuminated by the brilliant display. "Happy," Ross murmured in Abigail's ear, his voice barely audible above the noise. Abigail leaned into his embrace, taking in the moment, her family whole and together, their place in the community secure, the shame that had once defined her now so distant it might have happened to someone else entirely. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "You." "Beyond words," Ross replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Thank you for getting off that stagecoach in Independence all those years ago." "Thank you for being there to meet it," Abigail countered, "for seeing past my fear to who I could become." Above them, the fireworks reached their climax, a cascade of color and light that reflected in the eyes of their children, eyes that held only wonder, joy, and pride. Just as Ross had promised,